The trade market bell is starting to ring. What will the Minnesota Twins do when August 3rd hits? Hello and welcome to the Twinkie Town Tavern, where the beer is always cold, the Twins talk is always hot, and the stools are always open. I'm your host, Josh Kolojeski, inviting you to grab a drink, pull up a chair, and let's talk about what the Minnesota Twins are going to do at the trade deadline next week. Monday, August 3rd will be the final day for the Twins to make any meaningful moves from the outside of their organization, and for all teams, for that matter, to do just that. And in the last couple of years, this time of year has been very, very disappointing. A welfare Christmas, if you will, where if we are getting anything, it is stuff that is very, very cheap and very, very useless. And in the times when we're not getting anything, it's because we are completely selling the farm. And of course, that was the case for 2025. So in today's show, we're going to talk about last year's trade deadline. We're going to do a quick recap of that, as well as some analysis of what those moves look like just 1 year later. And we'll answer the question whether or not Derek Falvey actually cooked last season at this time of year, despite having to gut some of the roster. After that, we'll take a look ahead to next week's trade deadline and some of the candidates that are going to be available at that time, and we'll see which of those the Minnesota Twins should start targeting in order to bolster their roster heading into a potential postseason run over these next 2 months and hopefully into October as well. I've got my ideas, I've got the plan laid out, and I even got some of the potential names that could be on the move from the Twins side if Minnesota does indeed go down the buying direction, which we talked about in the last podcast. I am advocating for 100%, as long as you're not, going all in to the point where you're having to give up some of those top-level prospects like Walker Jenkins, Emmanuel Rodriguez, Kalen Culpepper, all of those guys. But I am in from a regular sort of buying perspective that is more so than they did in 2023, more so than what they did in 2024, and obviously a lot more optimistic than what they were able to do in 25. So that is the plan for today's show. Again, thank you for joining us here on the Twinkie Town Tavern. We are a member of the Grey Duck Sports Network. You can follow us on Twitter and on YouTube at Grey Duck Sports. And we're on TikTok at grey.duck.sports. There you'll find not only clips from this show and our two other podcasts on the Grey Duck Sports Network, which is the Grey Duck NFL Show and the Vibe of the Vikings, but you'll also find content that has to do with past things, history of Minnesota sports, history of the NFL, and little fun facts and my musings from whatever the day's news may be. Again, that is at Grey Duck Sports on YouTube and Twitter, and at grey.duck.sports on TikTok. Well, 1 year ago, maybe not to the exact calendar date, but the Minnesota Twins made a decision that really changed the course and changed our hopes for this franchise in both the short term and as well in the long term. That is when they went and had a total fire sale at the 2025 trade deadline. And in 2021, 2018, those were other prominent years where the Minnesota Twins were sellers. And in 2018, they sold a lot. 2021, they probably sold more. But I think even if you combined those two times of selling, it wouldn't add up to the damage that was done to the 2025 roster at this time last year. A couple of days before the trade deadline was even official, on July 28th, Detroit acquired Chris Paddock and Randy Dobnik from your Minnesota Twins. And we'll go through the list here and break it down piece by piece by piece. But as we look at it, it looks like there were a double-digit number of players that were traded away from your Minnesota Twins. And in return, Minnesota got a lot of prospects, some of which are already out of the organization, some of which I think are promising for the future of this franchise. But when all is said and done, the 2025 roster lost about half of its inhabitants. And the first of those to go again were Chris Paddock and Randy Dobnak. And now, in a typical year, you're going to be selling those players. If you are a team that doesn't have playoff aspirations at this point, you're going to be selling, first and foremost, the players that have just 1 year left of control. And if you're going with the rest of this season and then another year left of control, then you're getting a little bit more. That would be if the Twins were to trade Joe Ryan this year, that same sort of deal. And Chris Paddock falls into the camp where it was just going to be a 2-month rental. And that was going to be a move that the Twins made regardless of whether or not they decided to go into this full frontal assault of their roster. Chris Paddock was going to go, and Chris Paddock did indeed go. And he did not have a good stint with Detroit and was 2-3 with the 6.32 ERA, and he's 0-7 for the teams that he's played for. I believe he's on Texas right now this year. The major thing for me in this trade that I think maybe gives it the edge for the Twins getting a quote-unquote win is that you got to get rid of the Randy Dobnak contract, which was a contract that you kind of locked yourself into in the first place when you offered him a lot of guaranteed money after the 2020 season and thought, okay, that changeup looks like it's going to take the next step and it'll be able to play. And then he just never was able to find out how to be a major league pitcher ever again. And instead of having, $3 million, which doesn't sound like a lot and which isn't a lot at the major league level, instead of having that $3 million invested in a back-end start of the rotation arm or even a bullpen piece, you had that wasting away that $3 million each year in AAA. And for a team that has been as penny-pinching happy as the Minnesota Twins have been over the last 2 or 3 years, that was something that possibly could prevent Minnesota from making any other moves. A hindrance for Minnesota in the offseason for adding an extra $3 million to a contract because that $3 million is already invested in St. Paul. So getting off of that contract, even though I think it only had a year or two left, was the key part of that trade. And the Twins received Enrique Jimenez, who is not going to really probably do too much. He's down at the high A level, hitting .241 with a .397 on base percentage, but just a .409 slugging percentage, 6 home runs and 17 RBIs, and he's on the injured list as it currently stands. So I don't think the return was, the return is what you'd expect for a trade that gets rid of Chris Paddock for a back of the rotation starter who has just 2 months left on his contract that is really only going over there to eat innings and save some of the postseason arms that Detroit would later use. That is kind of the return that you could expect, but the main thing here that made this a successful trade was getting off of the Randy Dobnak contract. A trade that proved that this was indeed going to be a complete teardown of the Minnesota Twins roster was Jhoan Duran going to the Philadelphia Phillies at this time last year. There was no, reasonable excuse for them to trade away Jhoan Duran if we're just thinking about it in terms of, okay, we're not competitive in 2025, but we want to be competitive for 2026. And Jhoan Duran still had years on his contract left that he would be under Twins control and would be a part of the next successful iteration of this Minnesota Twins team 1 or 2 years down the road. Whether it was just a reload for 2026 and waving the white flag in 2025 or, a 2-year, 3-year rebuild, Jhoan Duran was likely going to be able to be a part of that roster. The problem is Jhoan Duran was going to get paid significantly more than he had been in 2025, with the arbitration raises continuing to bump up and him showing himself to be a premier reliever in Major League Baseball. And that, again, money coming down to being the key issue here. If you are a team that cannot afford to have any fat on the margins, you cannot pay a reliever $10-15 million a year, which Jhoan Duran might have been due. That money has to be invested elsewhere, or else you're not going to be building other parts of your team that get more playing time. A relief pitcher is very pivotal, is very good. A back-end closer, obviously, that can shut the door, is an important part of any title run. But at the end of the day, it's a player that is going to be in the game for about 300 at-bats during the course of the season. And if you're spending $10 to $15 million on that and you don't have wiggle room anywhere else, then that is some of the fat that you need to trim, and Jhoan Duran was a consequence of that. The good news is, though, that Minnesota got a pretty good haul for Jhoan Duran in Mick Abel, who we've already seen have success, and then a catching prospect named Eduardo Tate, who right now in the minor leagues, he's not having a great season, but had some hitting traits that were definitely eye-popping at first, and he certainly has the power. He's hitting .222 with a .288 on-base percentage this year, and it looks like a .442 slugging percentage with 18 home runs in, one every 3 or 4 games. So he's got the power, doesn't necessarily have the hit tool, but still some promise nonetheless. And then Mick Abel, who we've already seen, has provided a lot of promise for the future prospects of this Minnesota Twins rotation and what he was able to do in his couple of starts that we saw from him this season. After his first one was just kind of a little bit more disastrous, but we saw him able to really shut down opposing lineups. And for years, Philadelphia had Mick Abel and Andrew Painter as their top 2 prospects coming up in the pitching realm. They were going to join Zach Wheeler, and they were going to join Ranger Suarez and Christopher Sanchez and be a pivotal part of that Phillies rotation moving on into the future. But now that player is with the Minnesota Twins in Mick Abel, one of those once promising prospects, showing his promise now for the Twin Cities. So I think you got a good return for a relief pitcher, but let's also not discount the fact that Jhoan Duran is having an incredible season, and since going over to the Philadelphia Phillies, Duran has 40 saves and an ERA right around 2, and he has 80 strikeouts in just 56 innings of work. So he is still the same Jhoan Duran, but the Twins, knowing that, again, they have the budget issues, not Derek Falvey's fault. That is a self-limited function. That is the owners making that decision and saying we're not going to go over this much. They could not have a budget problem if they didn't want to, but again, Falvey was constrained by the orders of the Pohlad family. And then also, if you didn't think the team was going to be successful for 2026 and maybe not even 2027, then Jhoan Duran doesn't really have a place on that roster. He's just going to be wasting away. Another player now in this next move that was on his way out was Danny Colomb. He went to the Texas Rangers. He was a left-handed reliever that Minnesota had acquired in free agency that year. And Colomb had a good season with Minnesota last year. And after he was traded away, it didn't go so well. He has had a minus .3 WAR since leaving Minnesota, and this is a player, again, that you would expect most teams to be selling at that point. That was not out of the realm of possibility for a team that was well below 500 at the trade deadline in 2025 and only had that 1 year left of control. So Danny Colomb goes, and they get Garrett Horn. Garrett Horn, again, not going to be a very relevant player for the future of the Minnesota Twins, kind of a 20s to 30s to 40s sort of prospect that really is only going to see time at the major league level if he takes unprojected sorts of development. But again, what you'd expect to get from Danny Colomb. Now on to this trade that was probably the one that even now I think you can still scratch your head at, although I do like the return from this one. And that is a trade with the Toronto Blue Jays that sent now all-star relief pitcher Louis Varland and first baseman Ty France over to Toronto in return for outfield prospect Alan Rodin and Twins pitching prospect now Kendry Rojas. And Louis Varland had a ton of team control. We talked about some of the team control that Jhoan Duran had. Louis Varland could have been a part of multiple iterations of the next successful Twins team, whatever it was that looked like coming out of the bullpen. But again, and he wasn't even going to be hitting arbitration anytime relatively soon. I think he still had 4 or 5 years of team control left. I think this was in Falvey's mind, I think he would justify this as an opportunistic move to get away from a reliever that has been good, but also has had his ups and downs, and to also throw in Ty France in order to get an intriguing left-handed pitching prospect in Kendry Rojas. That's kind of thing that I think was the logic behind Derek Falvey getting rid of Louis Varland. Toronto was willing to get rid of Kendry Rojas and also throw in a solid hitting prospect in Alan Rodin if you were willing to part ways with the reliever. And now if you're building a team for 2-3 years down the road and you're still expecting your budget to be sitting right around for your payroll at least the $100 million mark, then having a guy that can be a starting pitcher in Kendry Rojas, or even if he's not a starting pitcher, is going to be making the minimum as a reliever, that salary is not going to bring that sort of fat. You're going to get a lot of value from him, whether he is a starting pitcher or a relief pitcher. And right now, I said in the last show that I think Kendry Rojas has the stuff and should be looked at in this Twins rotation as their number 4 or number 5 guy, especially as long as Mike Paredes is out, and if we're going to be very strict with that innings limit that they've set on Connor Prelip. Kendry Rojas, 2.81 ERA. Alan Rodin hasn't panned out so far. He's hitting 186 during his time with the Twins, with a 247 on base percentage and a 243 slugging percentage. Meanwhile, Louis Varland just made the All-Star game for the first time. He has a 3.1 BWAR. He has a ERA that is just a bit above 1.02, 22 saves, 3-3 record. Varland has been incredible and looks like he's going to continue to have a long career with the Toronto Blue Jays. So I'm not going to say that that is a win for Minnesota in any sense, but I do like bringing Kendry Rojas in, and I think one day we could see if Kendry Rojas reaches my wildest imagination's projections. If he reaches that level or even half of that level, then I think we can look back and say, oh, the Twins actually did win this one. But right now, without being able to project that and looking at the facts as they currently lay, I would say, yes, Toronto very, very easily won that trade. Here's one that I think that Minnesota definitely won no matter what, and that is getting rid of Griffin Jax, who was a great reliever with an attitude problem, and bringing in Taj Bradley. Now, the Rays have converted Griffin Jax from a reliever to the starting rotation. That was something that I wanted the Twins to do going into 2025. Jax originally made his debut with the Twins as a starting pitcher in 2021. Then they moved him into the bullpen for the rest of his Twins tenure, 22, 23, 24, and the first half of 2025. He started out in the bullpen this year for the Rays, and then they moved him to the starting rotation, kind of like what they did with Zach Littell. His stuff hasn't necessarily played to that same level. He has some decent ERA numbers, but the peripherals are not as great as you would want from a starting pitcher like Griffin Jax. And again, it's a 3.89 ERA, but it's only a 0.2 WAR so far in his 16 starts this season for the Tampa Bay Rays. So they haven't been able to use him as the shutdown reliever. When they tried to use him as a shutdown reliever, it didn't work. And now he's just a middling starting pitcher that just recently made it into the 6th inning for the first time in his Rays tenure during his last start. Taj Bradley, meanwhile, has been a lot more electric. And obviously, trading a reliever for a starting pitcher with a ton of team control and on a cheap contract is going to be something that you do 10 times out of 10, especially one that had the stuff, the splitter that the Twins liked, that is as good as Taj Bradley. And Bradley having a much better season. Bradley this year, 9-4 with a 3.69 ERA. The peripheral numbers are even better. His walk rate is down to just 3 walks per 9 innings, which is a miracle as far as his past numbers have been concerned. And he has 129 strikeouts in 114 innings. And he's been Minnesota's second best pitcher throughout the season behind Joe Ryan. They've formed a formidable 1-2 punch at the top of the rotation, and him and Joe Ryan's success have been the key reason why the Twins are still in the wild card race at this point. Because anytime the Twins could have possibly gone on a long losing streak that would completely sweep them out of the postseason picture, they have the stoppers like Joe Ryan or Taj Bradley. So I think that is going to end up being an overwhelming victory for your Minnesota Twins. Again, a reliever that was going to be arbitration eligible, going to get a big pay raise that you can't afford if you're constrained by a penny pitching owner, and turning that into a starting pitcher that has his play will exceed his contract value during his time with the Twins. Now, the one that was the hardest to swallow maybe was Carlos Correa going to Houston for Matt Mikulski, who Matt Mikulski was a reliever at low A in Houston, who at the time of the trade had a 6-point-something ERA. I think it actually might have been even more astronomical than that. And this was the Twins essentially dumping salary. Now, with the Twins eating so much of that contract, because I think Carlos Correa obviously has a lot of value and has proven that value over with Houston. Granted, now his ankle's injured, but when he's out for the rest of this 2026 season, but when he has been healthy at Houston since making his return over there last year's trade deadline, he's hit really well. He's having good offensive numbers. He's not looking like the hitter that he was with the Twins in 2026. He's looking like the all-star that he was with the Twins in 2024. So that was a hard pill to swallow. But again, I think just necessary if you wanted to build a competitive team. If you are hampered by a $30 million contract that has an ankle potential problem with all of the medicals that the Twins had seen during Correa's free agency process, and that looked like at that point he was starting to decline. If you are spending $30 million over the next 4 years on that, then you are going to have a hard time filling any other part of your roster with any type of talent and stay underneath that $100 million budget that it seems like has been self-imposed. I still think you probably could have gotten at least a better lottery ticket than one that metaphorically seemed to be a losing ticket that had, like, you're getting a ticket that already had proven to be a losing ticket. Like it was last Tuesday's Powerball number that you got. That's what Matt Mikulski in hindsight was, or maybe not even in hindsight, but in foresight also was. But getting rid of Carlos Correa, obviously Houston wins that trade, but the Twins do, from that point, get to be a little bit more flexible with how they build their team. They get more breathing room, even if they do have to pay, I think, $70 million or received $70 million from Houston in order to help offset some of that contract. Philadelphia Phillies get Harrison Bader for Jeremy Valoria, Henry Mendez. That one, no-brainer. Bader was on a 1-year deal. You flip him with 2 months left to go in a season where you're not going anywhere. That's, again, a move you're going to make 10 times out of it. 10. Henry Mendez is actually having a pretty good season this year. 295, 382, and 448 is the slash line down between double and triple A this year. So it looks like Minnesota might have a promising another corner outfield prospect. So that is encouraging. It looks like Harrison Bader, who only played those 2 months with Philadelphia and didn't have a terrible time. He hit 305, 361 with 463, but it didn't translate to any postseason success, and he's already on to his next team. I think Minnesota, you could say, ends up getting the win in that one. A Dodger trade that I liked at the time and then found out how bad James Outman really was. That was giving Brock Stewart, an injury-prone reliever who was in the midst of his one good season with the team, giving him to Los Angeles for an outfielder who, in the recent memory, had a good hitting season with his 2023 where he had like 21 home runs and showed that he could be a competent Major League Baseball bat. But I think that man was kidnapped during the 2023-24 offseason and replaced with an actor akin to the drunk actor in The Prestige that is hired to do the disappearing act for Hugh Jackman's character in that movie as the stunt double. That is who I think James Outman was replaced with, because he hit just 151 with a .224 on base percentage, .302 slugging percentage, and it looked going into this year, it looked like, okay, that trade could be a wash. Even after Outman was released earlier on in the season, it looked like, okay, that trade could still be a wash, because Stewart pitched once for the Dodgers last year, then was injured and missed the rest of the season, got injured again early this season, and it was kind of the same old story. But now it looks like he is healthy and is taking some good innings of work out of that Dodger bullpen. Right now, he has a 2.03 ERA in just 13 games during the 2026 season, and he just picked up his first save of the year very recently. So it looks like right now, maybe even marginally at this point, but the Dodgers win that Brock Stewart trade. And finally, Chicago the Cubs getting Willie Castro and sending us Sam Armstrong and Ryan Gallagher. Those are kind of more lottery ticket arms, whereas Kendry Rojas was a higher pitching prospect. The pitchers Sam Armstrong and Ryan Gallagher both were kind of on the precipice of going one way in their development or the other, and it seems like they've both kind of taken a step back, and they weren't highly touted prospects in the first place, but it was worth taking a flyer on those two for a player, again, that was about to become a free agent in Willie Castro. So what is the final verdict on all of this? And I would say that in hindsight, looking back a year ago, Derek Falvey cooked. And I know a lot of you will think, how could he have cooked when he decimated the roster? And we had guys who were essentially faceless players on MLB The Show coming into the lineup and into the rotation and into the bullpen for the rest of that season. Well, first I'd say, well, that season didn't really matter. And so a lot of those guys that we traded away weren't going to be here for 2026 anyway. And the ones that were going to be here for 2026 in Joan Duran, Louis Varland, and Brock Stewart, and Griffin Jacks were all relievers, players at positions that have less comparative value to starting pitchers and your positional players. And they were going to get paid like average level positional players or average level starting pitchers, getting into the double-digit millions of dollars contracts. So I guess not the double digits, but the 8 figures contracts. And that was just not something that the Twins could do and then build any sort of successful team around. And so they traded away. They trimmed the fat. Derek Falvey didn't decide that the Twins were going to limit their budget significantly. We're going to limit their payroll and try to squeeze every last penny out of this team. Derek Falvey didn't decide to put the Pohlad owners $400 million in debt and make them bad business people. Derek Falvey didn't decide any of that. Derek Falvey was given the chips, or given the cards, and played the cards as best as he could and set this Twins team up for the success that it's been able to have this year. So I would say unequivocally, even though there were some clear losing trades there, Derek Falvey cooked at this point last offseason. I said it then that he might have cooked, and I've now come to the conclusion today that he did, in fact, cook. And it was a nice parting gift, him getting us Josh Bell before being unceremoniously let go back in January. And I think we can all look back on this now and see that Falvey did a good job of building this team, not only for 2026, but for 2027 and 2028, and giving Jeremy Zoll now a good piece of footing to continue to build out this roster. And how is Jeremy Zoll going to build out this roster? Well, we're going to be buyers at the trade deadline this year. The Minnesota Twins are going to be looking to add pieces in their bullpen and perhaps in their starting rotation. I'm not exactly sure if they're going to try to add any positional players for a lineup that is pretty deep and has scored more runs than anyone in the American League at this point. Even if it doesn't have a true superstar sort of player behind Byron Buxton, I think you're going to focus on the rotation and the bullpen. And at first I thought it would probably only be the bullpen, because if you're going for a rotational player, you're either going to have to go for an ace like Tarek Skubal, and then you're significantly hampering what your farm system for the future. You're going to have to give up 2 of your top 5 prospects at the least, and another one in your top 10, and another in your top 20. And you're only going to get Tarek Skubal for 2 months, an ace like that for 2 months. And the Minnesota Twins are not in a push all your chips in sort of atmosphere right now. So I didn't think, okay, if you're going for a starting pitcher, if you get an ace, you're giving away the farm for a 1% chance at winning the World Series, which is a little bit better than your 0.1% chance right now. A middle of the rotation starter is still going to cost a pretty penny in terms of prospect price. It's going to cost maybe one of your top 5s or 2 of your top 10s, and you're going to be giving up something of significant future value to get a starting pitcher that I don't think is going to make that much of a difference. So the starting pitchers that I was looking for were ones kind of like what Carlos Correa was last year. A player on a bad contract that a team is looking to dump, that has all-star capability, but still has a lot of years left on a deal that they don't really like, so that you don't have to give up as much. And I've settled on 2 players. One of those is former all-star pitcher Luis Castillo of the Seattle Mariners. And if you take a look at Seattle, they are a team that is in the playoff hunt, but they are also a team that has been plagued by a good problem of having too many starting pitchers. They have 6 starting pitchers that they have in a 5-man rotation. And in the past, this has worked because it seemed like one of them would be injured every year, so they were all slotting into those 5 spots. This year, they've all been healthy, and this year, they've had to have Luis Castillo or Emerson Hancock piggyback starts or switch off spots in the rotation. So Castillo goes for 4 innings, Hancock goes for 3 innings on one day, and then they switch roles the next time as Hancock gets the 4-inning start, and then Castillo comes in for more. And both players, Luis Castillo especially, has been very vocal about how he doesn't like that sort of setup. And so the Mariners have been looking to trade either Emerson Hancock or Luis Castillo so that they can be rid of that problem and just have 5 starting pitchers focused on winning their starts and not being thrown into this limbo of, is it going to be a 6-man rotation? Is somebody going to piggyback this week? And Emerson Hancock, I think you'd have to give up a little bit more value, but I think you could get still that higher old ceiling from Luis Castillo, and you don't have to give up as much value. Now, the problem is he has a very expensive contract that includes vesting options and player options, but it does give you him through the 2028 season. So you'd get the rest of this year and then 2 more years of team control, albeit you'd be paying a pretty penny for it in terms of salary. But if Tom Pohlad means what he says and that he's going to invest in this team, well, then adding that sort of contract shouldn't be that off-putting, especially when the Mariners have even said that they are willing to eat a significant portion of that contract, just like the Minnesota Twins did with Carlos Correa's deal last year. They ate a significant portion of that contract because the Mariners want to get some sort of prospect package back, even if they understand that it's not going to be any team's top 10. They want to get something back. They don't want to get Matt Mikulski back, like the Minnesota Twins got last year. So I put in that the Minnesota Twins should trade for Luis Castillo, and in return, the Mariners get Ryan Gallagher, the starting pitcher, one of the starting pitchers, the one that probably has more upside that the Twins got from the Chicago Cubs, and Alan Rodin, who right now the Twins have a logjam of corner outfielders. Alan Rodin, still 26 years old, is a proven major league piece that Seattle could use if they believe that he is a good hitter, and they are still trying to kind of buy, but also get rid of one of their problems. So if they want a major league platoon hitter, I still think Alan Rodin is much better than what he's been hitting so far. Then I think that could be a fair price to pay for a starting pitcher that's not having his best year, although some of the stuff beneath the hood would say that he is still the same pitcher that he has been, or is only a step below and not the 3 or 4 steps below that his surface levels number would tell you. That pitcher on a quote-unquote bad contract, but now what are you getting? $12.5 million of that $25 million deal if Seattle's paying half? So you're only paying $12.5 million for a guy that could be your number 2 pitcher, number 3 pitcher on any given year through the rest of his contract. And at worst, you have just 1 year. If he doesn't hit his vesting option, if he's bad in 2027, you can just make sure he doesn't hit his innings limit or area where his vesting option would take over. I think it would be a good move to go and get Luis Castillo and put him into the starting rotation, because right now it's a starting rotation that is so injured and doesn't have any depth and is about to lose Connor Prelip because of an innings limit that the Twins have put into place. And this would allow Connor Prelip to have an effect on the team throughout the rest of the season, because you could put him in the bullpen and now his innings limit is going to be way off in the distance. He might not even hit the innings limit this year. And then you can use him for the postseason. You wouldn't be, so that allows the flexibility to do that. And I think his slider would play really well in the bullpen. Because I want to keep adding to the depth and adding to the floor of this starting rotation, I would then go and trade Mitch Keller for Dave Festa and then another top 10 to 20 prospect in the Twins system. Dave Festa, because he has promise even though he's injured, and then a top 10 to 20 prospect to help that potential injury-prone player, that pill that the Pirates would be swallowing, make it easier to swallow, just a little bit of a sweetener, so that at the very best they can view themselves as getting a decent prospect, even if they're getting a player that's never going to play Major League Baseball again. At the very best, they're getting a decent prospect with a premier pitching prospect at one point. Not a premier pitching prospect, but definitely on the upper tiers of pitching prospects for Mitch Keller, a upper Midwest native. I think he's from Iowa, who I've wanted the Twins to get for a couple of years now, to kind of fill out a fourth or fifth spot in this rotation. I think he can bring you a little bit better stuff than what Bailey Ober gives you, and that allows now Ober, if you're bringing in Keller to take the Mike Paredes or God forbid the Kendry Rojas role, unfortunately, you're putting Rojas and Paredes into the bullpen, making that stronger, you'd think, and then you have Bailey Ober, who's your current number 3 starter. He's moving behind Castillo and Keller to be your number 5 starter, and we already kind of liked him as a number 3 starter for what he's been able to do this season when he hasn't been injured. Now, I also want to build up the bullpen with some veterans that have proven themselves to be closers for big teams, so that it doesn't always have to fall on Yoendris Gomez, and that he can have veteran presence to lean on as the Twins make their playoff push during these final 2 months. I want Angels reliever Kirby Yates, and I want Orioles reliever Andrew Kittredge. And if we go to the baseballtradevalue.com website, which has been a helpful resource for me to see exactly how valuable all of these prospects are, it seems like you could get Kirby Yates for catching prospect David Benuelos, who again is in that top 15 to 20 range in the Twin system, and it is a flyer for the Angels. They're just getting rid of a reliever that only had 2 months of team control left anyway and is already 39 years old. It makes sense. And then Andrew Kittredge for Kalai Rosario, again another once promising infield prospect for a guy that only has those 2 months of team control left, and both of those players, Yates and Kittredge, have had success this year, and both of those players are being paid pretty low contracts because they were brought in on deals where it was essentially a one-year prove-it deal with the teams that they signed with, and they've proven themselves to be capable, and now their contract is not going to be something that prohibits the Twins from trying to acquire them. And then I also want to bring in one more lefty now that Anthony Bonda's season is over because of injury, and I looked at a long list of guys that fell within the range of guys that would be available for cheap, are still effective, and are left-handed, and I settled on Brennan Bernardino from the Colorado Rockies for Ben Ross and Kyler Fedko. So Brennan Bernardino has had a couple of really good seasons quietly in Colorado. He has an ERA of 2.74 this season, and he's not a big strikeout guy, so he's getting weak contact in Colorado without getting the strikeouts. He's still producing without swing and miss stuff in one of the hardest places for pitchers with no swing and miss stuff to play in Colorado, because typically every other pitch that's put into play goes over the fence or goes into the gap for a 2-run double because of that thin air. For whatever reason, that hasn't been the case with Brennan Bernardino, and I like that sort of stuff to play in this Twins bullpen. And then now you're looking at a team that goes from having one of the worst bullpens that can maybe get up to middle of the road with that sort of stuff. Kirby Yates, Brennan Bernardino, Andrew Kittredge in the bullpen, Luis Castillo, Mitch Keller in the starting rotation. The Minnesota Twins need to make those moves by this time next Monday. And of course, that'll be an off day, and we'll be able to talk about it when it comes and see if the Twins did make any moves, see if Ryan Jeffers or Joe Ryan is on the way out, if they surprise us all and decide to sell. It'll be a fun week of prognostication and trade rumors for your fans here in Twins territory. But back to the baseball. Later on this Tuesday, the Twins begin a series with the Kansas City Royals. The Royals send Seth Lugo to the mound. He's 4-6 with a 4.36 ERA. Taj Bradley goes for your Minnesota Twins. He's 9-4 with a 3.69 ERA. The Twins just a game out of a playoff spot. If the season ended today, they are right on the cusp of the postseason. So this is going to be a pivotal series against a team that has kind of already packed it in for the 2026 season. Should be a series where the Twins win 2 at least, and hopefully you think would be able to sweep. That game is going to be tonight, and we will recap it here later tonight on the Twinkie Town Tavern. And that is going to be your last call for Twins Talk this evening, as we are going to say goodnight and let you know that we're thankful for you pulling up a stool and joining the conversation at the Twinkie Town Tavern. We'll see you back here after tonight's game. Go Twins!